Welcome to our deep dive into Canadian family law. You've sent us some really interesting legal decisions, and you seem pretty curious about how courts figure out things like parenting arrangements and financial settlements when couples split up. So we're going to take a look at three cases today. Each one's from a different province.
It's amazing how these cases show you the human side of these legal battles. It's not just about dry legal principles. These are families dealing with some really intense and personal stuff.
Exactly. So let's head over to Manitoba for our first case, RHN and JPN. This one involves a couple with two kids. B and G are their names, and they're trying to work out custody. But it's not simple. There are allegations of family violence, which always makes things way more complicated.
Absolutely. When there's violence involved, the court has to put the safety and well-being of the children first. That's where Section 16 of the Divorce Act comes in. It lays out all the things judges have to consider to decide what's in the child's best interest. And there's a big focus on the impact of family violence.
And in this case, the court found that the father was actually responsible for most of the violence. Even though both sides were making accusations, there were physical altercations, and even attempts to control the mother by preventing her from using the car she needed for work. It really paints a picture of a volatile situation.
Yeah, it does. And to figure out what was really going on, the court relied a lot on expert testimony. They brought in two social work custody assessors to evaluate the parents and how the father's behavior might be affecting the kids. Their assessments really swayed the judge's final decision.
It's interesting how the kids reacted so differently to everything. The older son, B, decided to cut off contact with his dad entirely, but the younger daughter, G, did really well with a shared parenting arrangement. It just shows you that there's no one-size-fits-all solution when it comes to kids and divorce.
It really does. It highlights the importance of looking at each child's individual needs. And in this case, the court recognized that, and they ended up giving sole decision-making authority to the mother when it came to G. Because it was pretty clear that the parents couldn't even agree on simple things like extracurricular activities.
Right. Now let's talk money. The court used the set-off method to calculate child support, which is pretty typical for shared custody cases. But what's interesting is that they decided not to award occupational rent to the mother, even though she was living in the former family home.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. That decision shows you one of the tricky things about the set-off method. It's supposed to be fair by considering both parents' incomes, but doesn't always take into account all the things the spouse who stays in the home does. Even if they're not bringing in money, it can definitely cause some tension, especially when there's a big difference in how much each parent earns.
Okay, let's move on to Ontario now. For the case of a non-B and non-B, this one involves two parents with PhDs, talk about highly educated, and their four children, who are all on the autism spectrum. Get this. The kids each speak 5 languages. Pretty impressive, right?
Wow. 5 languages, that's amazing.
It is.
What's really interesting here is how the court had to deal with both family violence and the unique challenges of raising kids with autism. It wasn't just about applying those general legal principles. It was about coming up with a decision that really worked for this specific family.
Yeah. And then there was this incident where the father took one of the kids on a long trip out of province without even telling the mother. That seems like a pretty big breakdown in communication and trust, don't you think?
Definitely a red flag. That incident showed the court that they needed to set some clear boundaries and that the parents needed to communicate better, especially since their relationship was already pretty strained. They ended up bringing in a social worker, and they recommended therapy for both parents to try to deal with the underlying issues that were causing the conflict.
And it sounds like those underlying issues had a lot to do with how responsibilities were divided within the family. The mother seemed to be the primary caregiver, always putting the kids' needs first, while the father was more focused on his career as a professor.
And that difference in caregiving roles definitely played a big part in the court's decision about who got to make decisions for the kids. They saw how involved the mother was in the children's education and autism therapies, so they gave her sole decision-making power in those areas. But they also emphasized that the parents should make decisions together on other issues, with the mother having the final say if they couldn't agree. It's tough trying to balance protecting the children's best interests with respecting both parents' rights.
It is. This case also shows you just how messy things can get with financial settlements, especially when you throw in pensions and property claims that haven't been resolved. It reminds you that dividing assets fairly isn't always as easy as it sounds.
You're right. The court has to think about the long-term well-being of both spouses and the kids, not just what's happening financially right now. It's all about trying to find a solution that's fair and equitable. even when you're dealing with complicated financial things like pensions.
Okay. Let's wrap up this first part of our deep dive with a trip out west to Saskatchewan. For the case of SC and NC, this one's about a couple with 3 young children. And yep, you guessed it, a contentious separation. Seems like accusations of controlling behavior are a common theme in these cases.
Yeah, it does seem that way.
It does.
And in this case, it was the mother who claimed the father was controlling, putting work and socializing ahead of his family responsibilities. She felt like she was stuck with all the household chores while he had more freedom. It's a dynamic we see a lot. And it can really lead to resentment and conflict.
What really stood out to me was that the father also felt isolated in his own home. He said the mother's behavior made it impossible for him to have visitors. It shows how both sides often feel wronged and misunderstood in these situations.
It's the classic he said, she said problem. It can be really hard for the court to figure out the truth when you have these conflicting stories. In this case, they ordered a parenting assessment to get a better understanding of what was really going on in the family. And the assessment actually recommended that they keep the shared parenting arrangement. Even though there was so much conflict, it seems to suggest that both parents were capable of providing a good and stable environment for the kids, despite their issues.
Yeah, that's interesting. The judge also looked closely at the claims of psychological abuse and how they were affecting the children. It wasn't just about labeling the behavior, it was about understanding the consequences for everyone involved.
That's important.
It is.
And what's unusual about this case is that even though the divorce was tough, it actually seemed to make both parents better at parenting individually. Maybe the separation gave them the space they needed to reflect and become better parents, outside the pressure of their relationship. It's not what you'd expect, but it's a hopeful outcome.
It is. To try to prevent more conflict in the future, the court decided to split up decision-making responsibilities, giving medical decisions to the mother and dental decisions to the father. It's a way to avoid those constant battles over every little thing.
That makes sense. It's about creating clear boundaries and reducing the need for the parents to interact, which can be really important when there's a lot of conflict. It helps to lower the tension and lets everyone focus on the kids' needs.
Exactly. On the financial side, the court used the Contino analysis to figure out child support, which takes into account the big difference in the parents' incomes. It shows how these calculations aren't just based on simple formulas. They have to consider the unique financial situation of each family.
Right. The Contino analysis is flexible and makes sure that child support orders are fair and consider things like how much each parent could potentially earn and how much it costs to raise kids in a particular area. It's a nuanced approach that recognizes how complicated real-life finances can be.
Absolutely. The court also decided to award spousal support to the mother because she had health problems that were preventing her from working, which adds another layer to the financial picture and emphasizes how a relationship breakdown can have long-term financial effects.
It's true. Spousal support can be really important for making sure things are fair, especially when one spouse has put their career on hold or has health issues that affect how much they can earn. It's about recognizing that spouses often depend on each other financially and making sure both people have a chance to get back on their feet after a divorce.
And then there's the whole issue of dividing the family property. This case involved a pension, a big debt that was owed to the mother's family, and the former marital home, all of which needed to be carefully considered and divided up.
Oh yeah. Property division can be like a puzzle, especially when you have so many different types of assets and debts. The court has to look at how much each spouse contributed, how long the marriage lasted, and what both parties need to move forward. It's all about aiming for a solution that's as fair and equitable as possible to both sides.
So we've looked at 3 very different cases here, each one giving us a unique perspective on the challenges and complexities of family law in Canada.
And what's really striking is that even though the legal principles stay the same, how those principles are applied can be completely different depending on the individual family. There's no one-size-fits-all approach. It's all about finding solutions that actually address the specific needs and dynamics of each family.
Right. It seems like one thing that just keeps coming up in these cases is how couples just stop communicating with each other.
Yeah, it's like the number one thing that goes wrong in a divorce. It doesn't matter if it's disagreements about the kids or accusations about controlling behavior or even just not sharing basic information. Effective communication just seems to disappear.
Totally. And that communication breakdown just feeds the conflict and distrust that ends up with people in court. It makes you think, are we doing enough to prepare people for the communication challenges of breaking up? We spend so much time focusing on the legal and financial side of things, But maybe those emotional and relationship skills are just as important.
I think so.
Yeah.
These cases also show you how crucial those expert witnesses are, like the social work custody assessors we talked about.
Oh, yeah. They're like detectives trying to figure out what's going on in the family, observing interactions, gathering information, providing insight into the family dynamics. Their assessments can really make a difference, especially when it comes to evaluating those claims of family violence or figuring out what's really best for the child.
Right. It really shows you how important it is to have qualified and impartial experts involved. They
Er,
can really change things for these families who are going through such difficult transitions.
Thinking about these cases, it's pretty clear that the idea of family is changing in Canada. We've got blended families, same-sex couples, and families from all sorts of cultural backgrounds. The legal system has to adapt to these changes to make sure all families are treated fairly under the law.
And that's not easy. Look at the Ananbi case. The court had to think about the general principles of parenting, but they also had to consider the unique needs of children with autism. It reminds you that there's no one-size-fits-all solution in family law.
It's about finding that balance between those legal principles and the unique circumstances of each family. And speaking of balance, let's talk about the financial side of things. These cases are like a crash course in divorce finances, child support, spousal support, property division, even managing debt. It's a lot to take in.
It is. It really highlights how important it is to get professional advice, whether it's from a lawyer, a financial advisor, or a mediator. They can help you understand your rights, negotiate fair settlements, and make good decisions to protect your finances, especially during such an emotional time.
One thing I noticed is how divorce can have a long-term impact on women financially.
Yeah, that's definitely true. Statistically, women often see a bigger decline in their finances after a divorce. It could be because they earn less, or because they took time off work to raise the kids, or just because they were the primary caregiver during the marriage.
It makes the court's decision to award spousal support in that Saskatchewan case even more important. It's not just about giving financial help, it's about acknowledging all the things women do within the family and helping them get back on their feet financially after the divorce.
Absolutely. It's about giving women the power to rebuild their lives, whether that's through education, going back to work, or getting help with financial planning. It's about going from dependence to independence.
These cases also make you think about the role of the court itself. It's kind of a double-edged sword, isn't it?
Definitely. On the one hand, you need the legal system to protect children's rights, make sure assets are divided fairly, and resolve conflicts that families just can't handle on their own. But on the other hand, the way court proceedings work, that adversarial system, it can actually make the conflict worse and make it harder for families to move on.
So it's about finding that balance between providing a way to resolve things and recognizing that the court process itself can sometimes cause more damage. It makes you wonder if there are better ways to do things for some families, like mediation or collaborative law.
Yeah, those other approaches often focus more on communication, compromise, and finding common ground, which can be a lot healthier, especially when kids are involved. It lets families have more control over the process and come up with solutions that work for everyone without all the bitterness and expense of a big court battle.
It all comes back to finding what works for that specific family, which brings up a big question. How do we even know if these legal decisions are successful? Is it just about getting a legal outcome? Or should we be looking at the long-term well-being of the whole family?
That's the big question, isn't it? And there's no easy answer. But it's something we have to think about as we try to figure out what family law should look like in Canada. These cases show us the real people behind these legal battles and remind us that it's about so much more than just rules and regulations. It's about people's lives, their hopes, their struggles, and their search for justice and fairness.
It's about finding solutions that protect the most vulnerable people, support families who are going through big changes, and ultimately help people get through the incredibly difficult and painful process of separation and divorce.
And as we learn more about these cases, it's important to remember that the law is always changing. It's constantly evolving to meet the changing needs of our society.
It's a fascinating journey, full of twists and turns, legal precedents, and real human drama. And we're just getting started.
We're seeing courts trying to deal with really complicated issues, trying to balance everyone's interests, and making decisions that have a huge impact on families all across the country. It's a powerful reminder that there's a human story behind every legal case.
And those stories can teach us a lot about the challenges, the complexities, and the incredible resilience of families in the face of really difficult situations. So now you've got a better understanding of how Canadian family courts approach those tough decisions about parenting arrangements and financial settlements after a divorce.
We've looked at the legal side of things, the important role of expert witnesses, how the definition of family is changing, and how these decisions can affect everyone involved in the long run.
But remember, these are just three examples from a really big and ever-changing legal landscape. Every family is different, every case is different, and the law has to keep up with the complexities of modern life.
It's a dynamic and fascinating area of law, and these cases give us a really interesting look at the human side of it all.
They make us think critically about the role of the legal system, the importance of communication and finding ways to resolve conflict, and how we can make sure things are fair and just when it comes to family matters. So what are your thoughts on these cases? What stood out to you? And what questions do you still have about how family law is changing in Canada? Family law in Canada is definitely not standing still. It's always changing, reflecting how society's values are changing, different types of families, and even just better understanding things like family violence and how it affects people.
And you can really see in these cases how tough it is for the courts, trying to take those legal principles and apply them to real families, where emotions are all over the place, and the decisions are so personal.
It's like they're putting together a puzzle, but the pieces keep changing shape. The law gives them a framework, but every family's got its own unique issues.
Exactly. That's why you see so many different outcomes.
Yeah.
There's just no single answer that works for everyone. Judges have to look at each family's situation, consider all the evidence, and make choices that are really in the best interest of the children.
It's a huge responsibility, and you can see from these cases just how much these decisions matter. They're going to affect these families for years to come, changing the relationships between parents and kids, and maybe having financial and emotional consequences that last a lifetime.
It shows you that the law isn't just some abstract idea. It's about real people and their lives.
And it's about finding that balance, protecting kids, making sure parents' rights are respected, and ensuring things are fair for everyone. It's not easy. But our legal system takes it seriously.
These cases also bring up some really interesting questions about what family law should look like in Canada going forward.
Like, how can we do a better job of helping families who are splitting up, not just with the legal stuff, but giving them the tools to handle it all in a healthier way, like communication skills, ways to resolve conflict.
Yeah. And how can we make sure the legal system is keeping up with all the different types of families we have now? Blended families, same-sex couples, people from different cultures, while still making sure things are fair and protecting kids. These are questions we're going to have to keep thinking about.
So we've gone through three different cases here, and you've gotten a glimpse of how complex family law can be in Canada. But maybe even more importantly, it's made you think about some new things and raise some new questions.
As you keep learning about this area, remember that every legal case is about a family, and every family has a story.
And those stories can teach us so much about the struggles families face, the good things that happen, and how strong families can be, even when things are really tough, especially when things are really tough.
This deep dive has taken you through some pretty interesting parts of Canadian family law. We've looked at how courts make decisions about real families, the role of expert witnesses, and how those decisions about parenting and finances can affect people for years to come. As you go from here, think about how what we've talked about might change how you see things like family, responsibility, and how justice works in our society. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.